It was an October afternoon, bright and chill with the false promise of peace, when the shadow fell over us. Not the shadow of an enemy plane, not the distant flash of a test site, but a cold, sudden darkness cast by the raw, undeniable truth delivered in a manila folder to the White House. We, as a nation, were basking in the quiet hum of the early 60s, a decade of new frontiers and youthful optimism, where our greatest worries seemed to be whether we could beat the Russians to the moon. We felt secure, shielded by two oceans and the vast, undeniable power of our own deterrent. Yet, in the span of a single afternoon, the world we knew, the world where a war began miles away, giving us time to prepare, time to decide, was obliterated. The photographs were stark, irrefutable evidence laid out on mahogany tables for the most powerful minds in our country to see. Soviet missile bases, built in secret, nestled in the green tropical soil of Cuba, a mere 90 miles from our shores. They were ready, they were armed, and they were pointed straight at our greatest cities, placing millions of our citizens, our neighbors, our children, us, under the immediate existential threat of annihilation. The game had changed, and every one of us, from the cane fields of Florida to the wheat fields of Kansas, felt the sickening lurch of history, realizing it had run out of time. We were not just observers. We were the principal players in a silent, terrifying drama that would determine whether humanity saw November or if the light of civilization would flicker out in a sudden, brilliant flash. The silence that descended upon that White House meeting, the gathering known to history as the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, was a silence that permeated every corner of our collective consciousness, even those of us who knew nothing of the crisis for those first harrowing days. It was the silence before the scream, the moment the whole world held its breath without knowing why. The realization was staggering. For the first time in our history, we were nakedly vulnerable. No longer could we comfort ourselves with the luxury of ours. Within 10 minutes of a launch, our great centers of culture, commerce, and government could cease to exist. That pressure, the burden of protecting us, the people, rested on the shoulders of a young president, John F. Kennedy, who in turn bore the collective weight of our hopes and fears. We knew him to be a man of grace and intelligence, but now he faced a test not of policy, but of sheer survival, for all of us. The debates within the ExComm were a microcosm of the agonizing conflict tearing through our national soul. On one side stood the powerful voices of the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, men seasoned by war, insistent upon swift, decisive action. They argued for an immediate, overwhelming airstrike, a surgical cleansing of the missile sites. Their logic was compelling. Hit first, hit hard, and remove the threat before it could be realized. The weight of their medals and their experience pressed heavily on the room. Their message a clear, metallic echo of the historical imperative to defend the nation with total force. This was the path of righteous anger and historical precedent, a path many of us would have cheered in ignorance. We, as Americans, understood decisive action. But the alternative, the terrifying nuance of the nuclear age, was pressed by the president, his brother Robert, and a handful of civilian advisors. They saw beyond the immediate military target, recognizing that an unannounced airstrike, a Pearl Harbor in reverse, as Robert Kennedy later described it, would be a moral and political catastrophe. It would guarantee a Soviet response, perhaps in Berlin, perhaps with their own nuclear strike, plunging us into the abyss. It was the difference between a skirmish and a holocaust. We needed a third way, a path of strength that did not instantly ignite the fuse. This is where the true American resilience, that deep well of cunning and restraint we possess, began to shine. They chose the middle path, the quarantine. We were not declaring war. We were establishing a line in the sea, a ring of steel and conviction around the island of Cuba. The word quarantine itself was a brilliant stroke of White House diplomacy, chosen precisely because it was not synonymous with blockade, which was technically an act of war under international law. This subtle linguistic distinction allowed the Soviet Union a tiny window, a moment to pause and consider before escalating. It was a gamble of extraordinary magnitude, betting that Nikita Khrushchev, the volatile Soviet premier, would flinch before the moment of impact. When President Kennedy finally stepped before the cameras on that Monday evening, October 22, 1962, the air was thick with unspoken dread. The news had leaked in whispers and rumors, a chilling current passing through our workplaces and homes. We gathered around television sets, the black and white images flickering, casting stark shadows on our faces. The president's voice, though firm, carried the immense gravity of his words as he announced the discovery and the establishment of the strict quarantine. He spoke of the, quote, clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace. He was not just addressing the nation. He was speaking directly to Khrushchev, to the Soviet people, and to the entire world, laying out the stakes in plain, unambiguous terms. We listened, rigid with fear and pride, realizing that our destiny and the world's was now steaming toward a single, unavoidable line in the Atlantic. The world held its breath as the countdown began. Our Navy, the pride of this great nation, deployed its ships in a crescent of containment, stretching across the ocean lanes leading to Cuba. We had 48 hours until the Soviet freighters, the Komails, the Gagarin, the Kimovsk, reached the quarantine line. Every report filtering out from the White House, every somber newscast, was devoured by us, the anxious citizens. We checked maps, traced the distances, and listened for the sound of air raid sirens that, thankfully, never came. The tension was not merely political, it was physical, a knot tightening in the stomach of every American family. We went to work, we sent our children to school, but under the surface of routine, our minds were fixed on those invisible ships sailing toward collision. Inside the White House, the ex-con continued its grueling, non-stop session, fueled by coffee and the grim determination not to be the generation that failed. They studied U-2 surveillance photos, their fingers tracing the outlines of missile sites and the shapes of cargo hatches. We were receiving signals, contradictory and confusing, from Moscow. Khrushchev was publicly defiant, condemning the piracy of the quarantine. But there were secret, back-channel feelers, tiny threads of hope that Robert Kennedy and others clutched tightly. The moment of truth arrived on Wednesday, October 24th, at 10:25 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Soviet ships were approaching the line. Our naval commanders were under strict orders. If a Soviet ship carrying offensive military equipment refused to stop, it was to be fired upon. That first shot, the first act of war, would change everything. The tension was unbearable, described later by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara as a moment of pure, agonizing suspense. Then, the first flicker of hope. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, famously said, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. 6 Soviet ships, 5 of which carried oil, 1 carrying timber, slowed, then stopped, and finally turned around. The world let out a collective, half-whispered sigh of relief. The immediate collision had been averted, not by bombs, but by sheer force of will and the strategic deployment of restraint. We had held the line, but the danger was far from over. The missiles already in Cuba were still being assembled. They were going operational. The timetable for a military strike was being rapidly accelerated by the military advisors who felt the quarantine was a dangerous half measure. We were running out of time. Then came the letters from Moscow, arriving on successive days, creating a dizzying, terrifying paradox. The first, arriving Friday, October 26th, was rambling, emotional, and deeply personal. A plea from Khrushchev to Kennedy to step back from the brink, offering to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. It was the voice of a human being, genuinely frightened of the fate of the world. We, through our leaders, finally saw a path. But the next morning, Saturday, October 27th, a day forever marked as the most dangerous in human history, a second, much harder letter arrived. Broadcast publicly over Radio Moscow, this message demanded the removal of our Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which bordered the Soviet Union, in exchange for the Cuban missiles. The Soviet military hardliners had clearly regained control of the narrative. The stakes had been raised. The exchange was now public, impossible, and humiliating. We were faced with a terrible choice: accept the loss of face and expose an ally, or launch the airstrike and risk Armageddon. The news from the battlefront was worse. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson, was shot down over Cuba. He was killed. The blood had been shed. The military response was instantaneous. The Joint Chiefs demanded an immediate retaliatory strike on the Cuban anti-air missile site that fired the fatal shot. The pressure on Kennedy to authorize the full-scale attack, the one that would inevitably spiral into global war, was immense. We had lost one of our own. The impulse for vengeance was powerful. But this is the moment where the deep wisdom and moral clarity of our leadership, representing the best of our collective judgment, saved us all. They chose a radical, almost reckless path of diplomatic fiction. It was Robert Kennedy who proposed the boldest move of the crisis: ignore the second, unacceptable letter and respond only to the first, conciliatory one. We are going to proceed as if that first letter were the only one we received, the president decided, cutting through the bureaucratic and military noise. While the official response was being crafted to accept the terms of the first letter, no invasion for missile removal, the real, definitive action was taken in the shadow of the White House. This was the true moment of clandestine heroism. On that night of Saturday, October 27th, while most of us were glued to the news, praying for a miracle, Robert Kennedy was dispatched on a mission of ultimate importance. His destination was the Justice Department, where he met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The setting was tense. the atmosphere thick with the fate of nations. Bobby Kennedy, armed not with a weapon but with the quiet authority of his brother, spoke plainly and forcefully. He delivered the official offer, responding to the first letter, the no invasion pledge. But then he moved to the heart of the matter, the key to unlocking the crisis that could never be made public, the Turkey missile swap. He told Dobrynin that while the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were obsolete and scheduled for removal anyway, the president could not, must not, agree to their removal as part of a public deal, as it would expose the NATO alliance to collapse and be a devastating political loss. However, he promised, in the deepest confidence, that the Jupiter missiles would be removed from Turkey within a matter of months after the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba was complete. This had to be a secret gentleman's agreement, a handshake across the nuclear precipice, known only to a handful of men on both sides. The stakes of this secret meeting were unimaginable. If Dobrynin leaked the information, or if the U.S. military hardliners found out before the crisis was resolved, the whole delicate structure could collapse. This was the ultimate act of leadership, prioritizing the safety of the world over political appearances or military dogma. We the people were saved by a diplomatic sleight of hand, a concession made in the dark, driven by a desperate desire for peace. The hours that followed were agonizing. We waited, not knowing the quiet promise that had been made. We saw only the looming threat of the airstrike scheduled for the following Monday morning. Then, on Sunday morning, October 28th, the sun finally broke through the terrifying darkness. Radio Moscow broadcast Khrushchev's message. The Soviet Union agreed to dismantle the missile bases and return the offensive weapons to the USSR. The relief was instantaneous, visceral, and overwhelming. The world did not end. We had stared into the void, and through a brilliant combination of public force and private compromise, our leaders had steered us back. The streets filled not with panic, but with a silent, profound gratitude. We had survived. The Jupiter missiles were quietly and secretly removed from Turkey in the spring of 1963, fulfilling the pledge made in the dead of night. The deal was kept absolutely secret for decades, known only to a tight inner circle. The crisis ended not with a bang, but with a whispered promise, a triumph not just of American might, but of our intellectual humility and our profound commitment to human life. This pivotal moment, this demonstration of American innovation in the face of absolute danger, remains a testament to the fact that our greatest strength often lies not in our bombs, but in our diplomacy, not in our loudness, but in the quiet, desperate courage of a few men willing to break the rules of conventional warfare to secure the peace for us all. It reminds every one of us that even when the chips are down and the stakes are existential, the human spirit, guided by wisdom and restraint, will always find a way to prevail. And for that, we stand tall, proud members of this great nation, forever inspired by the week we stared down extinction and blinked last. We look back now at that perfect, frightening October, and we feel a deep, reverberating pride. We were there. We endured it. Our nation, we held firm. It was our collective resilience, channeled through the White House, that allowed the sun to rise on a peaceful Monday morning. And that, my friends, is a story of American greatness that transcends any battlefield. The true genius, the deeply American innovation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was not the existence of the missile sites themselves. That was a Soviet challenge, but the invention of the response. It was the creation of a new kind of diplomatic tool, forged in the heat of a ticking clock. The military, our proud and necessary shield, gave us only two options: war or capitulation. We rejected both. Instead, we fashioned the strategy of calibrated escalation and secret de-escalation, a masterful piece of statecraft that should instill pride in every citizen of this great nation. To truly understand the drama, we must immerse ourselves fully in the claustrophobic tension of those XCOM meetings. Imagine a room often darkened, the only light coming from the projection screen showing the U-2 photographs. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the residue of sleepless nights. These men, our leaders, our proxies, were not aloof figures of history, but exhausted individuals wrestling with a choice that no human being should ever have to make. They were fathers, husbands, and citizens, terrified for their own families, just as we were terrified for ours. The military contingency plans were terrifyingly real. We had plans to strike Cuba, and the Soviets had plans to respond. We were told, and we believed, that a full-scale invasion of Cuba, the airstrike the generals were clamoring for, would result in the deaths of tens of thousands of American troops within the first few days. What was kept secret from the public, what even the president and his XCOM team only slowly grasped, was the chilling fact that the Soviet forces already on the ground in Cuba possessed tactical nuclear weapons. If we had invaded, they were authorized to use them against our landing forces, ensuring the incineration of our sons and daughters on the beaches, and guaranteeing that Moscow would launch its full counterstrike. The wisdom of the White House, the resilience of the civilian leadership representing our common sense and our shared humanity, was the ability to listen to the military's expertise while simultaneously overriding their judgment. We needed the generals to be ready to fight, but we needed the president to be ready not to. The argument for the airstrike, the surgical strike, was persuasive. It was emotionally satisfying. It was decisive. It was American in its directness. But Robert Kennedy, his voice carrying the moral weight of his concern for all of us, famously asked, "What is our goal? To destroy Cuba or to get the missiles out?" That question, simple as it was, cut to the core of the dilemma. It pivoted the discussion from military vengeance to strategic salvation. It was the recognition that we were in an entirely new kind of war, where the only winning move was the one that avoided the fight entirely. When the president announced the quarantine, we felt the immediate rush of action, the pride of seeing our Navy mobilized. But the real drama was at the line itself. Our destroyers, proud symbols of our maritime strength, encountered a Soviet submarine, B-59, a craft that was equipped with a nuclear torpedo. The U.S. Navy dropped small, non-lethal depth charges, practice grenades to force the submarine to surface, a standard procedure. What we didn't know then, what remained secret for decades, was the situation inside that pressure cooker of a Soviet sub. The crew was exhausted, disoriented by the heat and the lack of air, convinced they were under a real attack. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed World War III had begun and ordered the launch of his nuclear torpedo. For the launch to proceed, 3 senior officers had to agree. 2 men agreed. The third, Soviet second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, refused, arguing the need to wait for orders from Moscow. He was the single point of failure, or rather, the single point of salvation, that prevented a nuclear strike on our Navy and the resulting chain reaction that would have wiped us out. The White House, our ultimate command center, did not know the name Vasily Arkhipov, nor did we. But the decisions made by the ExComm, the decision to use practice depth charges, not lethal ones, the decision to employ the quarantine rather than the blockade, were what provided Arkhipov with the split-second hesitation he needed. Our calibration allowed for the human intervention on the Soviet side. Our restraint was reflected in theirs. We were saved by the courage of a single man on a Soviet sub, a courage made possible by the restraint shown by our leaders in Washington. This is the sublime, interconnected beauty of the crisis. Then came that agonizing Saturday, October 27th, the day of the 2 letters, the day the U-2 was shot down. Our collective fear was palpable. We started stocking canned goods. We checked on our neighbors. We watched the sky. The clock was ticking down to the military's deadline for the retaliatory strike. The generals were practically camped in the White House, their insistence hardening with every passing hour. The president's team, the men who carried our collective faith, needed a way to buy time, to provide Khrushchev with an elegant exit ramp. The public answer, the response to the conciliatory first letter, was brilliant. It offered the no invasion pledge that Khrushchev sought. But the secret key, the lock that only Robert Kennedy could turn, was the Jupiter missile swap. Imagine that, say,